Good afternoon. It's my absolute delight to see so many people here and from so many of my classes, and to be able to introduce prize-winning writer Lilliam Rivera, who is the author of several young adult novels, including Never Look Back and The Education of Margot Sanchez. Lilliam Rivera was born in the Bronx, New York, the location of her novels, both of these novels, but she currently resides in Los Angeles, where she teaches at the UCLA Writers Program. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Never Look Back, because that's the book that I read, which is a modern retelling of the Greek myth Orpheus and Eurydice. In this retelling, Yuri is a young Puerto Rican girl haunted by an evil spirit, Ato, who represents death and is selfishly seeking to take her with him to the afterlife. Additionally, however, Yuri is haunted by the horrors of Hurricane Maria, which prompted her and her mother to move to Florida after their home was destroyed. So Yuri is clearly dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, but her mother is very hesitant to have her seek out mental health support and encourages to find strength in prayer and her faith. So Yuri devotes herself to prayer, but she cannot free herself from Ato or the traumas of Hurricane Maria. And so this prompts her mother to send her to the Bronx to spend the summer with her cousin Penelope and her aunt Titi Silvia. In the Bronx, Yuri finds hope and light in the songs of a young Dominican-American musician, Orpheus. The pair spark a quick romance, and Orpheus soon learns what is haunting Yuri is more than just Maria. While he initially struggles to make sense of the spiritual realm, he catches a glimpse of Ato and comes to believe that there is more than what meets the eye. The book ultimately finds Orpheus seeking to liberate Yuri from Ato's grasp, but he proves outwitted, much like Orpheus, who lost his love just steps before they emerged from the underworld. Unlike in the Greek myth, however, Yuri finds a way to free herself, recognizing she never needed a knight in shining armor, just herself to find liberation. Now, one thing that I really want to emphasize about this book, because so many of you here want to be teachers and we're thinking about how to use young adult literature in the classroom, is this book's emphasis on mental health awareness, especially mental health awareness within the growing Latino community here in the United States. One thing I really appreciated is in the acknowledgments of this book, which is at the end, Lilliam notes that for the past 30 years, Latinas have had amongst the highest rates of both depression and suicide, but only 1 in every 11 Latinas ever seeks out mental health care. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this book and mental health and everything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay, good. Thank you so much for having me. I am zooming in from Los Angeles, but my heart is always in the Bronx, New York, always. And because of this pandemic, back before this pandemic, I was always going back and forth from LA to New York. My family all still lives there. They all live in the same community, around the same neighborhood. And it's basically where I set the book Never Look Back, and it's where I'm always trying to set my stories within this community. It's around 149th Street in the Hub. If you're from New York, you would know where that area is. So my stories are always I'm always thinking about the Bronx, New York, thinking about my family, thinking about Puerto Rico, which is, where my parents are from. And back in 2017, Hurricane Maria happened. And right at that moment when Hurricane Maria was landing on the island, I was on a book tour, and I happened to be in the Bronx. I had an event. I think I was going to travel to Boston right after, but I was in the house when we were, and I was watching the news. My parents are always having tuned to Puerto Rico's news all the time, and so we were watching it as the news was coming in very slowly about what was happening on the island. And my parents were just kind of stuck at that moment of what do we do, right? This moment of dread almost. And here I am, I'm having to, not only trying to console them in a certain way because I wasn't sure what was happening, really. We didn't know how bad it was going to get. And then having to travel right after. And as I was in Boston and trying to present my other book. I forgot what book I was presenting at the time, but you put a face. And I was waiting on I was having a book signing at the moment. And this one woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, you're Puerto Rican. How's your family doing?" And I wasn't, at that moment when I finally hit Boston, we weren't sure. I had an uncle who it was 85 at the time. He lived in the mountains of Puerto Rico and we couldn't find him. And we ended up, my cousins and all my brothers and sisters, we all went on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, just asking, this is where his town is, this is where he looks like. We cannot find him, we can't get a phone, we don't know what he's diabetic. It was just chaos. And at that moment, this woman came up to me and asked me, "How is your family?" And I broke down. The facade came off. I couldn't pretend that it was like I'm at a book tour and I'm talking about my books. She really looked at me and saw that, just that question made me think, oh, this is happening and it's happening in real time. So I talk, and as you mentioned, Carmen, earlier, for myself, I talk a lot about depression and anxiety and those kind of mental illness, all those things, addiction. I've written essays about my own battle with addiction. I'm an alcoholic. I'm sober for 20 years. These are topics that are not talked about. They're not talked about within my family. They're not talked about a lot in the Latinx community, maybe now more so, but back then for sure, it wasn't a topic that we really just talk about. It's something that you kind of like just keep it to yourself. If you can't drink, there is something wrong with you. And I come from a family of really hard drinkers. And for a long time, it wasn't something that I really talked about, until finally I just, I got sober and I really felt the need to just be able to talk about it freely and openly. But when Hurricane Maria happened, when all this huge things of like seeing our government treat the way they treated the people of Puerto Rico at the time, we all seen the clip of this man throwing paper towels at them. I've seen it hundreds of times, and the anger, the rage, right? And what do I do with anger and rage? Where do I go with this kind of like feeling of helplessness? The only thing I can do is write. And it is the gift that I have. I've been blessed with the gift of storytelling, and that's what I do. And I write. And it's really important for me to find a way, find a vessel, something that I could kind of gravitate and trying to deal with the rage that I had within me, because I didn't know what else to do, right? But I didn't want it to be about a rant. I leave rants for Twitter. For me, it's like I didn't want to be like, I'm angry at the government. I'm angry at this. I didn't want that to be, this is what they're doing. I really did want to write a story. How do I write about a story of helplessness, of feeling as if you're being attacked and pursued of this feeling of abuse, being in an abusive relationship, which is in my own way. Sometimes I feel that's what it feels like with Puerto Rico and America and the US. And so where do I go? I had to find some sort of a structure that I could write a story within. Like I needed a constraint. And for me, I found that constraint within the Greek mythology of Orpheus and Eurydice. It was a perfect vessel for me. It was a perfect structure because I read that Greek myth many times. And when I was really young, I was fascinated by it, and it also comes, it plays again into this idea of there is no original stories, that we're all kind of remixing and retelling the same story again. I mean, if you read the Bible, the story about Lot and how he turns into stone, his wife turns into stone. I love these kind of like mythology, big stories. And so for me, Orpheus and Eurydice is again a story that I wanted to remix and retell. And I found it, if I could find a way of writing about Hurricane Maria, which kind of grapples with these bigger themes about mental illness and depression, but still be able to still tell a story that is still, entertaining and young people will love, and also just introduce a conversation about things that maybe a lot of young people are afraid to talk about. And so I just, I wrote about, I used that Orpheus and Eurydice story, and as I do with all my stories and all my novels, is I do a lot of research, and I watched everything, every Orpheus and Eurydice retelling. I watched Black Orpheus, which if you've never seen Black Orpheus, is a retelling set in Brazil during Carnival. It's a beautiful retelling. I love that version. I've seen it hundreds of times. And then I went to Broadway and I watched Hadestown, which is a great retelling of currently on Broadway, it's amazing. The music is great. I read poems. I read different versions of the myth, everything and anything to just sort of help feed me until I decide that I was ready and full and able to write this story. And so I knew I needed to do an alternating points of view with Yuri, who is like Carmen mentioned, coming into the Bronx, spending the summer with her cousins. No one is talking about how she is in desperate need of help. Her mother believes that all she needs is to pray harder. And this is something that I was taught to me when I was young. I was like, just pray harder. If you pray to God, then you'll feel better. And I really believe you could do both. You could pray to God and go see a therapist. And so I really, I had Yuri come in, and I understood Yuri being the hardest person for me to write her point of view. And then I had Fierce, who was, of course, the charming, he's a musician. He has a gift of poetry, but he doesn't really believe his gift is anything more than just a tool to manipulate girls. And so here are these two very kind of two very different characters who meet, and I really wanted this idea of if you know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, of course, Orpheus is the one who goes into the underworld and seeks to help her, the knight in shining armor. And I really wanted to kind of present this idea that these two young people needed to sort of have a death. They both needed to shed something within themselves, whatever it was. If it's Orpheus really truly believing that he has a gift that's supposed to move mountains, and really kind of shedding this idea of what he thinks that he's meant to do. And Yuri also just really finding the courage within herself to dismantle and destroy this spirit, this angry spirit who is pursuing her, and just find the strength to overcome that. And just individually, yes, it's a love story. Yes, it feeds off of this idea of true love and first love and all those kind of things that you read about in young adult books. But I also wanted it also to really be about these two characters to just find the strength within themselves to overcome these kind of insurmountable things that are thrusted upon young people for the most part. And so these are just a couple of things that I, when I'm writing about Puerto Rico, I'm always finding new texts that I could read about. Sometimes it's very traumatizing, but I wanted to share this. Like, this is a pamphlet I found in a vintage store here in Los Angeles. It's fascinating, right? Because it has all these amazing little stories about, like, this is like a pamphlet of like selling Puerto Rico, come to Puerto Rico, right? We have amazing, pineapple stands, we have beautiful people, and it's a very, it's created by tourism back in the day in 1950s. I'm fascinated by this idea. But then I also have to read books by Ed Morales, and Morales wrote this like heavy book, which sometimes I find like I read these books and sometimes I really need to take breaks because they're so hard to think about, right? Fantasy Island by Ed Morales is very heavy, and he does talk about Hurricane Maria's. There's another book the war by I was trying to look for it in my library, but I have to think about the name of the title. It's right here behind me. But another book, like I read all these like very nonfiction books, they're very heavy books. I try to read as many as possible whenever they come out. I'm fascinated by the things that have had that the history of Puerto Rico and how it affects all, myself. I really believe that everything has history. The buildings that are built in the Bronx, right down to this history of pain and trauma. I think about this angry spirit as Ato, as a person who's dealt with, who's like consumed by all this pain and suffering from the island of Puerto Rico, and all he thinks about is like he could, I don't know, he finds something in salvation within Yuri, but it's all this, disturbingly messed up, right?
Yeah.
And so, but I just really believe in this kind of idea of nothing is just black and white. There are fingerprints, and our fingerprints are in all the buildings in the Bronx. Our fingerprints are in all the buildings in Puerto Rico, and it travels with us, this pain. And so just to talk a little bit about mental illness, as I mentioned before, I've been sober for many years, and raised Catholic. My parents are very strict, but it was never ever thought of like maybe my depressive states or the amount of like depression and anxiety that I've dealt with there was never ever a question of whether or not I should see someone professionally. It was always a question. It was always just, if you pray, you need to calm down, you pray harder. And I understood why Yuri's mom really believed that. And I wrote a story, and I think I mentioned it in the acknowledgement, is I wrote a story about like 7 years ago for Cosmopolitan. And it was, and surprisingly, they wanted me to write a story about Latinas and the high suicide rate. And I was surprised by how not only how high it was, but it was just like the stories kept on going the same way in a lot of ways. I spoke with a lot of young women who had dealt with suicide ideation, and they were openly talking to me about their experiences. And it always came like, it almost felt like it was following a script in a lot of ways, of these young people who were like burdened with such huge responsibilities of not only like thriving maybe as students, or thriving, trying to go to college and seeing what that's like, going to college, and just leaving the house for the first time, and then having that huge burden of just trying to maintain, but being unable to speak to your parents about what's really happening. And then until they could no longer contain that, right? And that's, and this is a question, whenever I've spoken about in this book, and particularly, it was really interesting to see how many people sent me letters and emails in regards to like, oh, I felt this way, or I didn't know how else to talk about this, the experiences of feeling really down and unable, and sensing that is a weakness, instead of there's a moment like now, especially because of the pandemic, I feel like the talk is way more open about self-care and seeking help, and and that anxiety, you don't have to go through it, and that it's not a weakness on your part. But it has been for many years that has never been the case, especially for young. And it's always been considered, as I don't know as for myself, but it's always been considered a luxury to be able to see a therapist. It's something that is not cheap. It is not cheap. But I'm way, I've found ways, online meditation. There's YouTube, for 10 minutes, I will do that, and YouTube meditation is okay. But anything to try to find ways of being able to deal with these kind of like huge, mental states, depression, anxiety, but never look back again was my way of coping with this not only, it wasn't just anxiety, but it was just a lot of anger, because I felt like I needed to write towards hope, because at this moment when Hurricane Maria happened and the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, which is still affecting my family that lives there, people still talk about like, and my roof doesn't, is leaking. Well, they're still talking about like, I'm still waiting for money that never showed up, aid. They're still like, we're still dealing with the ramifications of what happened and during that time. I felt like using a structure of the Greek myth was my way of really kind of coping with it, with my depression, with my own depression, my own helplessness, and finding ways of these two characters could, write towards this hope, right towards this better life, this inkling of like something could happen that could change, and then and on the other side as well is just then I get to play around with mythology. I get to introduce mythology from the Caribbean island. I get to play around with, Dominican mythology. I think about, the power of music and bachata and lamentations, and this idea of incantations, of how music in itself is a way of creating spells. And so that was really the way I was thinking about when I was writing this book. But it did take a toll. I did go to therapy. I did find a way of trying to manage, trying to write as truthfully and honestly as possible through these characters, but it also can manifest physically, and that's something that, if even throughout this whole pandemic, because this book came out during the pandemic, if I'm correct, because time is really weird, but it came out, I think, during the pandemic. And it was very strange, right? Because it was during the pandemic. I had to speak about these things that are as in real time dealing with like insurmountable things that we never thought we would ever deal with, right? But I love the story. I love the story. I love the strangeness, the darkness that it entails. I wasn't aware at the time, but it was until later, like after it was published, I realized that I was writing about an abusive relationship. I didn't know that until afterwards. Like sometimes you just write and then you make the connections after. But I realized a couple of years later that I was like, oh, this is a story about this abusive relationship that might have occurred to me a while back. And I'm like, here's Ato, who is the literal, he embodies that the stalkerish person who will not let go, right? And it's always good to see. It's always good to see these kind of themes that pop up, right? I never know what I'm going to end up writing or what's going to show up in the writing. But at the time, I was really just wanted to see how can I remix this story and write about Hurricane Maria and write about the plight of Puerto Rico and not be a historical story, not be a nonfiction story. I could tell people to read Fantasy Island. I could tell people to read The War Against Us, and just, read all these historical books that do a way better story, job at explaining the history of Puerto Rico than I can do in a young adult book. But again, first is an entertaining story. But second is me being able to introduce these bigger themes that maybe are overlooked and in other young adult books and in fiction in general itself. Okay, so I don't know if I've been rambling on for quite some time, but I always feel like I love to speak about it. Like I have my notebook. This is the notebook that I used as I was jotting down all my all my notes. I usually have a notebook that I work on first. I just write notes, like, I would put Orpheus and Eurydice, or maybe her name is Yuri, or maybe, his tag name is Fierce. Maybe he, all these things, and I'll just accumulate it until the notebook is completely written and done. And then I'll start an outline, and then I'll start writing. And then I give myself a deadline, and I'll write certain amounts of words per day until I have a draft. And then the draft is rewritten and rewritten. And then I have an editor who gives me more notes. And then I rewrite until I have a completed book. I mean, it doesn't sound as easy as that, but I wish it was easier than that. But the best part is always the research part. To me, I love that part. I'm like, let me just read all the things. Let me watch all the movies. Who's written what. I love those. That part is the best part for me. I even watched, that's right, I even watched the opera, Orpheus and Eurydice opera, which was gorgeous. And it also was tied with these dancers, ballet dancers. And, every single time I would watch every version, I would cry, because I'm a Cancer, that's my sign. So I cry every time. So I would cry every single time, as if I didn't know what was going to happen. But yeah, those are the moments. To me, the hardest part is always rewriting. I get, you use a different part of your brain, I feel, when you rewrite a story. But the first part is when you write the draft, I just throw it out there and I just let it be as sloppy as possible, and just let go of what I think the reader might say, and just allow myself to be free in that sense. But when I have to rewrite, that takes way more time. And then I'm forced to just sit down. And just to, I also hired people to read it. I hired people who lived in Puerto Rico to read the book, to make sure that I was getting parts of Yuri's history and the way she would speak or things like that. I wanted to make sure that I made sense. So I hired someone who we call sensitivity readers, and they would read my book and give me notes on that. My publishers hired someone else to read it, who was Dominican. And so it was just we always made sure to just kind of, I'm just, because my name is Rivera and I'm Puerto Rican, does not mean I'm an expert in anything. I make sure that I hire people, or make sure that I have people around me who are. So I did that to just make sure of all those things. And yeah, and then I think that's it. So that's all I did for Never Look Back, which I really appreciate. I appreciate anyone reading it. Also, the illustration, which was really kind of important to me, was that they both be Afro-Latinos, because they were, and they were both Afro-Latinos. And my publishers, Bloomsbury, were very kind, and I had no problems making sure that happened. There've been horror stories with authors who don't have a say as to what their cover will look like. I've never had that. I've always been really blessed with great covers, and been able to give slight notes about them, because they just get me, get what I'm trying to do. But Yuri and Fierce being Afro-Latino is really important, because that's the way they came, that's the way they were. Those were the characters. So, all right. So any questions you may have for me, I would love to answer whatever you want.
Lilliam, I want to thank you so much for sharing all of this. And I'm sure my students have some questions, but I have a question. I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about I guess I would call it spiritual syncretism of this book, because you definitely have some Greek mythology at play, but you also have, as you mentioned, the Caribbean goddess of hurricanes, and then you also have the Roman god of death. So if you might talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, and again, like, it was basically like I'm looking at the original Orpheus and Eurydice mythology, and I'm like, what are the gods that they use? How did they name them? And of course, there's so many repeats, right? Like they show up again and again. And I try to align as many as possible with the Caribbean aspects, of who's the person in charge of hurricanes. Of course I would have to have that god. Who is in charge of God? Who would be Charon or Chiron? Like I would change up the names. Like I'm like, I just wanted it to be as, to me it would seem as if the characters, if we're coming into the space, the characters are going to be familiar to these people in some way, even if they've never met them. It was like, if it's Fierce, the things that happen to him when he's dealing with, being a bachata singer, then we're going to have to talk about like maybe the Dominican aspects of Carnival, or the Puerto Rican aspects of carnivals, or their mask. In my house, my walls are all full of paper mache masks from Puerto Rico, from all over the island. I'm obsessed with those. I love masks. And I feel that's true with both of these characters, of sort of masking, hiding how they're really feeling. And so I'm like, what are monsters look like in the Caribbean? And I really wanted to try to stay in that space as much as possible. And my work is like, I love kind of mythology and folk tales that are Caribbean based, Latin American based. I love those kind of tales, and I'm always trying to figure out ways of incorporating it in my work.
Does anybody have any questions for Lilliam? Jameson?
Hi, yeah. I was wondering, I noticed that there's like a theme of self-liberation, especially with the main character. I was wondering if that had anything to do with the politics of many Puerto Ricans who are fighting for their own sovereignty. I just wanted to know if that was an allegory that was supposed to be there or something I just made up in my head.
No. Yes. Well, it's interesting because when I finished writing the novel, I was rewriting it, and it was coming towards the end when it needed to be published. It was right at that moment when Puerto Rico was ousting the governor, right? And the island became like, it was like I was like here in LA and wondering if I should fly to Puerto Rico, like I was just like, this is happening, and it was so powerful to watch, to witness, right? And I almost wanted to even add a chapter, of it in my book, of like, and Yuri and Fierce end up, marching with them, I was like, that's where they would be, and but I come from a person who is not from, I don't live on the island. I cannot speak for those who live on the island. There was a point in time back in the day when I was in college, when I was like, yeah, liberate, Puerto Rico libre, and I still lean towards that. But honestly, I am not a voice for, only the people in Puerto Rico can be the voice. But I do know that the government has been corrupt, is still corrupt. So, I am not as adamant as I used to be. Back in the day, I would be like, Puerto Rico libre forever. Right now, I'm more like, Puerto Rico knows what they want. The people in Puerto Rico knows what they want, So my politics is always very anti-capitalism, down with the people, down with the band kind of situations that always kind of hints throughout my work. But honestly, that's how I feel.
And I know Andrew has a question. Andrew, can you unmute yourself? No? Okay, I'm gonna ask you to, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris and Carmen and everyone else involved in organizing this talk. And thank you most of all, Lilliam, for your writing and for talking to us about it. It's just wonderful to hear authors. And I'm in a room with 3 student teachers in local schools, in
Yay.
local high schools and middle schools. And a 4th one will be appearing either online or in the room at some point. And this is one of the things that we're dealing with is, we're always working with the everyday problems and challenges and joys of being in the classroom and sharing them with our students, but we tend to, especially in the literature that gets assigned and the books that are available, it highlights trauma, and of course there's a reason for that, that people are interested in exploring trauma. And I like how you said before that it seemed like writing seemed like a form of therapy for you, and when you think about readers, and maybe I don't know if you can talk about this or not, but from the responses you've gotten, especially from young adult readers, do you see the readers talking about how the process of engaging with your books is itself a form of therapy, or is it just they're still caught in the trauma of life in the underworld or above ground?
Andrew, I so appreciate your question, because this is a conversation that I have with my fellow authors, my close fellow authors that we're dealing with all the time. Like, we're dealing with this idea of, am I commodifying trauma by creating these stories, and re-traumatizing these kids, right? I honestly, I sometimes I question my own, there's a I know for a fact that young readers want to see themselves in the work and want to be able to have these kind of bigger conversations, right? So here's a story about these two young lovers, budding young lovers, emerging young lovers who are facing these obstacles that are unreal somehow. But I come, we all know, right, is that most kids are dealing with things that are like unbelievable, right? We all know this, right? How to have this conversation? How do we talk about, like, yes, this idea of like, oh, here they are sharing music together, how beautiful that is, this moment of being in a space by themselves and just listening to music, and then also being able to like slay gods and goddesses down. That's really empowering for young readers to read. So I come from I also have to really believe that there's hope, because I will be honest, and probably in the very first the first versions of this novel did not have hope. If I really followed the Orpheus myth, I would not have had her live, be able to leave. She would not have been able to, she would have been caught in that cycle of despair, right? But I knew that could not be the case. I needed hope. I needed her to find strength to like uplift herself and free herself, her and Fierce, both. But so it is a challenge, right? I don't want to keep perpetuating this concept of the only person of color story is the trauma story. I really don't believe that. But I know that kids want both. Like they want the light fare and they want the heavy fare, and maybe they want a combination of both, of two of those things, and I could only hope I'm doing that. I don't know. But it is a question. It is a big question. It's a dilemma for me.
Yeah, well, I think the injection of hope into that story is really important, and I'm glad that you changed it.
Yes, I couldn't imagine them not doing that. I'm like, I don't care what the Orpheus story is. For me, my story is hope that they both had to let go of something to be able to be free again. And so that was key.
Great, thank you.
It also reminds me, Lilliam, I was just telling to Carmen, I was texting Carmen that, the other book, the Education of Margot Sanchez, is that, there are similar themes here, but there's that power, that strength that she has, even though things begin to sort of crumble around her, or the reality of her family situation and what's going on in her family. So even though there is trauma, there's also hope, there's strength, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's like we're all talking like we're talking about this, like breaking the cycle, right? And for Yuri is specifically talking to her mom about like we both need help. We both been through so much. We can get help outside of just outside of religion, right? And Margot too, in a sense of like, yeah, her life is kind of family life is kind of crumbling, but she's learned that she's not tied to what her family or mom or dad are going through, that she has other avenues. And I love that you mentioned Margot, because I feel if you read Margot Sanchez, there's a character there who comes up in Never Look Back, who pops in again, and I'm like, there they are. It's like the world is just always right here.
I have another comment, but does anyone else have a question? You can raise your hand, or raise your virtual hand or your hand, or otherwise I'll make my comment and we'll see where that goes. All right, I'll make my comment. So one of the things I really appreciate in what you were speaking about is that research is the best part, but how important research is. As Andrew and Carmen know, I am also the honors thesis chair. So I kind of guide and do all the paperwork for the students who are going to write an honors thesis, as well as, we guide all our students in the work they do. But that's one of the challenges, is that when they do research, is that to help them to understand that the research isn't this big, it's this big, right? And then what you write is maybe only this much, but you had to do all of this to get to this. So I appreciate that you talked about all the different things that you looked at, that you read, that you viewed, but then also that you say research is the best part, because that's what we think. The product of the research are our articles or our books, but it's the path, it's the process that is, and the journey that is the best.
Oh, it's my favorite part. I'm like, I might start off with a playlist. There might be the first song that I can create, in this playlist, but then I'm like, what articles, what other versions have come up with this mythology, what's happened in Puerto Rico. I read New York Times articles. The most upsetting article that came up was how these young kids, and I think I mentioned it in the book, was how these young kids after Hurricane Maria stopped talking. And it broke my heart. And here's true facts of how Hurricane Maria affected young people, a generation of young people. And I'm like, how, these are the young people that I keep thinking in my head, like these, how it affected them, right? And I, and it is you go through a hole, right? Because then I'm like, oh, what more? I'll stay on research forever if I could, but then I have to like put it all aside and then write, But it is my favorite part, because I'm just like, I'll interview people. I interviewed people who went through the Hurricane Maria. I spoke to them on the phone, and what was it like? Can you walk me through, what happened? And all these things, and my background is in journalism, so I don't have a problem interviewing people or speaking to people or strangers or experts or anything. That to me is, again, it plays up with the things that I used to love when I was writing as a journalist, is being able to speak to people about their experiences, and it just adds to the story itself. Oh, and I'll just add, the book Never Look Back is being translated in Spanish for an audiobook. So it'll be an audiobook, a Spanish translation of the audiobook. And the translator was working with me, just letting me know, how do you say this, or what does this mean? What are you trying to say here? And she sent me the version just the other week, and she didn't, I don't know if she hired someone to sing the last poem or the song that Fierce does, when he's like imploring the gods to let them go. And the translator hired someone to sing the song in Spanish. I'm like, what treat? This is my life. It's amazing. I don't know. It was just like so like beautiful because I'm trying to write a poem that's like a song that's like, what would a kid from high school write? Poetry. It's not like you try to be really kind of like very love and stuff and kind of a little cheesy. But then when I heard him read it in Spanish, I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. These are the treats I get for writing.
I have a question kind of jumping off of what Chris was
Mhm.
saying with the research. One of the things that I also really enjoyed about the book were this little insertions of history. So for
Yeah.
instance, because you have Orpheus's character, Orpheus is essentially, he's a history buff. And so everywhere they go, he's kind of giving some background information. And I'm just kind of curious with this book, what do you hope that young people will get from it? Are you hoping that they're going to want to dig more into history? They're going to want to dig more into injustices, environmental injustices, or what is it that you really want to inspire in young kids with this book?
I mean, this is tied again to how do and I don't think about this like in the sense of when I'm writing this book, but I guess after the fact, I'm like, how do history teachers or English teachers can find a way of making, high school teachers can find a way of making Never Look Back a little bit more robust if they were to introduce it into their classroom, right? And I was a history major in high school, and so I imagine like here's Fierce, who comes from a father who loves to give him insight into the world, like, oh, you want to hear about what happened, here's the Young Lords, history about 1970s, here's the history about this Lincoln Hospital, and I grew up in an environment where my father would tell us these things of like, oh, this is what happened. I'm fascinated by that, by how things occurred, like just recently realizing that Dodger Stadium was going to be a housing project before it became Dodger Stadium. Like, I didn't know that. I'm like floored, that's huge, right? And so the displacement of people, throughout history, in Puerto Rico and then in the Bronx, and just, so if I could find a way of inputting any kind of tidbit information, historical information, it was easy because Fierce was a history buff, that was the easy way for me to do that. But I wish I could do that with all my books, honestly. Like, I'm like, here's, and side note or footnotes, of like history, even if it's a rom-com kind of story, I would love to just be able to do that as a kind of like points of like information about how things are related, that's what I love. I love learning about those things, and I love to be able to input it. And Never Look Back was a lot more easier for me. And I'm always thinking of, going back to like tying it all back to like what, to New York, to the Bronx specifically. It's just a really great way for me to even discover the Bronx, that building in the Bronx, that fort has so much history that I went down the rabbit hole of finding out what it used to be used for. It was a barracks at one point, and now they're saying it might be an entertainment set, but nothing has happened. It's still abandoned. It's huge. And I'm like, this, here's a huge building that's just not being utilized in any kind of way really right now. And and it has so much history. So it's my way of being able to like, inject a little bit of history into my work.
Mhm. And also, I would say just not only just the history, but I mean, back to the themes in the book, and even both of them, the Never Look Back and then the Education of Margot Sanchez, is also that sense of belonging. Where do I fit? Mm-hmm. And I think for a young adult audience, that's really significant.
I think so. I mean, I've said this before, when it comes to young adult writing or writing for young adult books, it's really the discovery of first. You discover your father is a drug addict. You discover that there is an underworld that you didn't even know that your father was a part of. There's like, it's a discovery of first. And so for me, I'm always thinking about that when I'm writing these characters, that they are really discovering something new, and it's like on that verge of adulthood, really seeing the world differently, but also just seeing it as almost with an adult viewpoint, towards the end in a lot of ways. And so and it's important for me to always just remember that, that these aren't, the adults who are like, oh, governments, I hate everyone. And it's more like, yes, not being, helplessness is prevalent, yes, but also just maybe the possibility of like they could change. I mean, we see it right now. We see it with young people going on marches as we speak, leaving classrooms, protesting against these trans, ridiculous racist, discrimination, all these things. They're leaving the classroom. To me, that's like, youth revolutions, youth movements have all begun at that age, and so it's very exciting to even try to capture little hints of what that might look like in a young person,
Mm-hmm. Taking on the world.
Right. I mean, when the pandemic, I have a teenage daughter, and when the pandemic began, she was just like, why can't I go to McDonald's? Why can't I just meet my friends? And that was just like this idea of like, oh, it doesn't affect you. And then finally she got, oh, it does affect me. It's like, it was very much like the extremes of it. And so finally it's like, oh, we're all affected by it, So yeah. But I would highly recommend, if you've never watched Black Orpheus, it's a really beautiful movie. I watched it when I was way too young in the Bronx. And I was living in the projects, and we watched it. It was on PBS always. And then I knew that was really most of the inspiration for my book. It was just like, oh, here's this young love, these beautiful Brazilian Afro-Latino love being showcased on screen. And although, and so I'm like, I wanted to be able to even capture a little bit of that, in my book.
I'm curious, as Carmen and I and Andrew, we all write it in our field. And one of the things that we know that happens is that we make a plan, and then we try to follow the plan. And sometimes you go down rabbit holes. You already talked about that. But sometimes what we planned, there are bends in the road. So when you sat down saying you knew you wanted to write about this, did you find bends in the road that what was produced or what was completed was not necessarily what you completely envisioned at the beginning?
For this book, I feel that I could have stayed longer in the underworld, in that disturbingly dark space. I felt like I could have gone darker, but probably for my own mental health, I'm probably a good thing I didn't. But for the most part, because I was really trying to stay in constraint, like in the structure, it helped me to maintain, instead of going off on tangents. When I do my first drafts on a lot of my books, I allow myself to go on long tangents, and usually like 50 pages cut, like it doesn't matter. I'm just playing on the page, and I allow myself to play on the page on those first drafts. But with Never Look Back, it just helped to have that kind of structure so that I could just stay focused, especially because it felt very personal. Like it felt like a very personal story. And so I really did need that even more of a constraint to allow myself to not venture off too far off,
Mm-hmm.
It really did help me in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. But those tangents sometimes, going off in those early drafts, Carmen and I have talked about this, that as we go back through and we clean our drafts up, we cut and we put that stuff at the end of a document or another document, because sometimes later on we come back to that and we think, oh, that's a whole other chapter or another article or another book.
Oh yeah, I don't lose anything. I keep every single thing. I keep all my cuts in the document. Everything is all in one space. I never you know, that notebook is probably the only notebook that I write longhand for the most part. You know, after that, I'll just write everything on the document, but I keep everything, you know, all my articles, all my side notes, all my tangents, because I could use it somewhere else. I'm like, oh, maybe this chapter, this, you know, whole chapters that I've deleted, I'll use it again later, or somewhere else, I'll repurpose somewhere, you know.
Yep. It's a creative odyssey.
The journey is the best part. The beginning is the best part. It's and then after that, you're just like, well, you know, it's published, and then it becomes something else. Like, you know, like having this person rewrite the Spanish, you know, lyrics. It becomes something else, and it's amazing just even having someone else create something else, you know, off of it. So.
That's great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I appreciate it. I love talking about Never Look Back. It's my favorite book of the books I've written, but hopefully I'll be able to write something else.
Carmen, you want to close us out?
Well, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming here, for sharing so much of your journey as a writer, and for writing this book and bringing attention to some very important issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you again for even reading it. I'm always in awe of anyone just even paying attention to what I write. Thank you again for everything.
Thank you, Lilliam. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.